Okay, we are calling to order the January 9th work session for the Carlton City Council. Could you please call the roll, please?
Councilor Grant Erickson.
Here.
Councilor Gavin Brandau.
Here.
Councilor David Stanton-Hill.
Here.
Councilor Carolyn Thompson-Riser.
Here.
Councilor Kevin Skipper. Councilor President Shirley Ward Mullen
Is here. She just stepped away.
and Mayor Linda Watkins.
Is here. Okay. So work session agenda, are there any changes to the agenda?
There are none, Mayor.
So we are going to continue with our review of the development code, and I think we have, it looks like we've got Elizabeth Decker here to visit with us on this thing. Hi again.
Hello, Mayor, members of council. Thank you for having me back to talk through this work session with you.
Thank you, and I am going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. And I'm joined tonight by Natalie Olivier, also with 3J Consulting. She works with Steve, and so will be helping us with meeting facilitation, as well as helping me keep time and notes and make sure that we have time to discuss all the interesting topics in this batch of code updates. So it wouldn't be a meeting without a PowerPoint, so let me get that started. I know you enjoy reading the hundreds of pages of code, but this is a little bit more of a summarized version. So overview tonight, we're really going to focus in. Oh, I did not fix this slide. My apologies. We're going to focus in on divisions 3 and 4 tonight, making sure that we have time to discuss some key topics, which are not these topics. That's my error. Start with just a reminder of where we are at in our schedule. We are coming off, we're about halfway through our review. We're coming off our November and December work sessions to talk through some of the first divisions of code. And tonight we're talking through the middle third of code before our February meeting where we take the third chunk of it. And then following that, we'll sort of update this draft with any additional revisions that have come up through our work sessions before moving into the adoption process later this year. So I wanted to start this batch of code a little bit differently than last time. Last time we had more questions, I think, just the zoning districts and development standards really lend themselves to that. But divisions 3 and 4 have a lot to do with engineering and improvement requirements, as well as some special use requirements. And so we spent the month with some additional coordination with the city engineer, Gordon Monroe, with Scott White with the COG, who helps with review on some of the technicalities of these. So I thought I'd start by giving you an overview. This is really a summary of the table that summarized the code changes. And then we'll go into the, there's 5 specific code topics that we've identified for conversation that are in your meeting tonight. So just thought we start with the overview and then get more specific. So as you know, we're on divisions 3 and 4. As I mentioned, those have to do a lot with the public improvement requirements, as well as we'll be picking up some residential design standards. I think that'll be a good section to discuss. And then some special use standards that have to do with things like PUDs, manufactured homes, and of course, vacation rentals. So in terms of that summary, starting numerical order, starting with division 3, the first big chapter there is talking about the street standards. So we coordinated with Gordon on this, pretty minimal changes. One thing that we had heard a lot of discussion about, way back during the code audit and some stakeholder interviews about this time last year, was that the street modification process for if a developer had a situation where the street section that they needed to fit into some specific site constraints did not match exactly what was specified in the TSP or the original land use decision, that it was really difficult to make some amendments. So Gordon had an example of like, there's a large rock, and by moving the sidewalk, like a boulder buried there, and by moving the sidewalk 3 feet over, they could, loop around that boulder and avoid heavy excavation. So that process isn't really well defined in code. Anything, whether it's moving the sidewalk 3 feet or changing the type of street, which is a more major change, requires going back to Planning Commission for a public hearing. And sometimes that just isn't the right step in terms of modifying to meet on the ground conditions. So we worked with Gordon to develop a two-tier process for minor modifications and more major modifications. Those major modifications that say a developer is requesting to use a different type of street or to modify the section at the time of land use application, that would still go to Planning Commission for review as part of that land division application. But if it's more of a minor change to address those conditions in the field, there would be an option for a staff level review. Next major chapter, everyone loves to talk about parking, and that is part of Division 3. So we kept the existing residential parking ratios for single family and multifamily, and then introduced specific parking requirements for duplexes, cottages, and ADUs. And duplexes are required to be 1 space per unit or 2 per site, similar to a single family, 2 spaces total, and that is set by state law. So that's why we introduced that, and that's our pretty clear recommendation there. The cottage recommendation of 1 space per unit, that also comes out of the state model code for cottages, is best practice, but is not legally binding for the city of Carlton, like the duplex requirement is. But we felt that since the multifamily requirement is 1 space per unit, that making it 1 per cottage, which is a higher density product, would be consistent and create more of a fair playing field between those different types of smaller developments. And then ADUs are exempt from any off-street parking requirements by state law. We also added some flexibility here, similar to the street modifications, where if someone wanted to propose a different parking requirement for a development, they could come in and there's a similar two tiers of modification. If it's up to 20%, it's a lesser review process. And if it's more than 20% deviation, there's new standards for how it would go to Planning Commission, what type of review and studies and approval criteria would be required. So hoping to add some flexibility, but still have some accountability. In the storm drainage chapter, that's another piece that we worked closely with Gordon on to enhance the review and development standards to ensure that there's adequate storm facilities. Likewise, utilities chapter, pretty minimal. The site and landscaping design is in chapter 1784. And we have some pretty significant changes there based on some of the council goals and direction. We're going to talk about these in more detail, but just to highlight where they sit in the overall code structure, and that the 3 big changes are adding some more specific requirements about what types of planting materials are required, requiring some of those to be native species while prohibiting nuisance species, and then introducing a street tree planting requirement. And then continuing through Division 3, there is also about half of the land division, the land division development standards are included in 1788. Those work in tandem with 17 with another chapter that has to do with the subdivision review requirements and has some additional requirements for subdivisions. Those 2 chapters work together to guide and establish standards for new subdivisions. And so just to give you a preview of what you have yet to see in terms of subdivisions, that chapter will introduce some additional options for lot size averaging for flexibility, some requirements to create open space within new developments, as well as we talked about the housing variety requirement, the idea that no more than that there be a mix of different types of houses in newer developments. And so those are all going to go in this additional chapter. So if you, like me on my first read through, were wondering, but when are we getting to the good stuff? It's coming in these two chapters work in tandem. This chapter, because it's more with the public facilities and improvement requirements, is more focused on how do those facilities need to be improved and to what standards at the time of land division. And so this is where there are some specifications about block length and lotting patterns, and that includes the requirements for a mid-block pedestrian or bicycle access way, which also relates back to council goals about creating more of these green pedestrian connecting facilities. And so we'll talk about that in a little more detail tonight. And then there's also just an opportunity for consistency and clear implementation to tie into those street tree standards in the landscaping chapter to really make sure that those get done at the time of land division. Next chapter has to do with access spacing. That includes things like how big the driveways can be, really minimal changes there. So not a lot to discuss. Likewise, the historic sites chapter, as we discussed last month, we're updating for consistency on using some terms around historic sites and definitions. But again, the city can continue to explore a more robust historic preservation program. And if they were to go down that or a local historic designation process, this is the chapter where all of that could be located, but we don't have those changes yet. And then the final piece in this Division 3 is a big one. It's the residential design standards in 17106. So the big changes that are being proposed there are to ensure that the same standards that apply to single-family detached dwellings, which at this time are solely focused on requiring a garage or carport with that dwelling, that requirement is the only design requirement that applies to duplexes and to 2-unit townhouses. And so the duplex piece is related to those state rules, same as the parking that kick in for Carlton at 2,500 population. So we're doing it now with this code update, knowing that that's right around the corner. And then applying that same standard to a 2-unit townhouse. We have, essentially could look very similar to a duplex, just has a property line running down the middle of it that can facilitate homeownership. That those projects, as we discussed last month, in terms of the level of review and the type of development standards that we would apply to it, this facilitates their development on an even playing field with a single-family detached. And that's probably something that we would see in the R2 medium density zone. That's where these are proposed. The design standards more generally talk about site and building design for multi-unit projects. So that's going to be townhouse projects with more than 2 units, as well as multifamily. Most of those we are not recommending changes to. There is one option right now, the access requirements for these multi-unit developments, primarily for townhouses, is where this is going to come in, require that all lots take access from an alley or side, and only under some really limited circumstances and fairly discretionary circumstances can they take access from the street, like through a driveway that connects right to the front of the street. And while alley access can be really great for townhouse projects or other multi-unit developments in large developments where you have a lot of site area and room to play around, it isn't always feasible and can really be an impediment to development feasibility of townhouses, is what we've been learning about middle housing across the state. And so the best practices recommendation around this is to really allow both of these options and not require the developer to demonstrate that there's a specific scenario, because it's really difficult to anticipate all of those scenarios and spell them out in code in advance. So really opening up the options here. The widths and the access spacing for those driveways will continue to dictate where those driveways can be so that any conflicts are minimized. But this just adds more options. As I mentioned, most of the standards were not updating. There were some clarifications to the multifamily open space standards, just for ease of implementation and to eliminate some overlap, but we're not changing the amount of open space required. And then a substantial change in this chapter is adding a whole subsection about the cottage cluster design standards that talk about the size and scale of individual cottages, as well as the site design of those cottages on the larger site, how they relate to each other and the common open spaces. So we're going to talk more about that in detail, but that's the wrap up of Division 3. And Division 4, luckily, is much simpler, especially because we deleted one of the 4 sections here. So Division 4 is relatively simple. It deals with planned unit developments. We made an update to the density standards there because we now have new density standards in the base zones. And so we could just eliminate a complicated calculation for density in this chapter and instead tie to the new standards being proposed. Planned unit developments are an option to create a more flexible, creative, ostensibly, I say creative because not in the sense that it's like artistic, but creative in the sense that it's a departure from the subdivision standards. So an alternative development standard generally for residential. Cities are really different in terms of whether their subdivision standards are the most popular or their planned unit development standards are the most popular. PUDs are generally more complex. They require more land use review because there is that greater flexibility and creativity. As I understand, there haven't been a lot of PUDs in Carlton, but it remains an option. But we didn't have a lot of specific feedback about how those standards were or weren't working. So we stuck to making some consistency updates. And you may or may not see those going forward, but they remain an option. For individual manufactured homes on an individual residential lot, the state law has really changed on this. And so the new standards are that an individual manufactured home has to be treated the same as a site-built home. And so there were some specific design, they weren't even design standards. There are things like a minimum size of 1,000 square feet for manufactured homes, requiring some Ramada space, meeting certain insulation requirements, foundation requirements, some of which are covered by building code, and so really don't need to be in the zoning code. And then the broader direction from the state legislature was to just regulate these homes the same as any other home. So things like that minimum size for a manufactured home. The city doesn't require that of a single family detached home. And so we were able to delete this entire chapter. So little bit of simplicity and simplification there. However, manufactured homes that are located in a manufactured dwelling park are subject to a different set of standards, and those remain in the code. We just had some updates to the terms to make sure there's manufactured dwellings, which is a broader umbrella term, and manufactured homes are one type of manufactured dwelling. So we made some updates for consistency throughout that chapter. And then the final piece in Division 4 is the vacation rental dwellings. And we will talk about that in greater detail. As you know, there have been some changes proposed, and we've talked about what this could mean for housing and what types of dwellings to be used there. So let's all take a breath before we dive into the key topics. Any just clarification questions to Divisions 3 or 4?
Looks good.
All right, thanks. So as I previewed, we've got 5 key topics. They're detailed in the memo. And I wanted to just start off by saying that the draft code is really our initial recommendation on all of these issues, sort of the best thinking that we've pulled together based on what's in the code, what we found in the code audit, what we've heard from stakeholders and users of the code, both like city staff and private developers. So in terms, I know last month there were some topics where we had a clearer recommendation in some of these questions. And I think for most of these, the code is our recommendation, and we want to offer this opportunity to talk through these topics, give you a little more detail. And if there are areas where you're interested to see further refinements, or you're just interested in the background of where that recommendation came from, this is our opportunity to do that. So we're flexible if there's a direction that you want to go, but we do recommend the draft on each of these topics. So just, for consistency's sake, I guess numerical order, we thought we'd start with landscaping and tree requirements, which comes first in the code packet. So there's a couple pieces that I understand will be that we wanted to highlight for review. So the first is that this code includes some more specific ratios of trees, shrubs, and planting materials within required landscaped areas. The current code just says, do landscaping, but it doesn't really say, like, could you just put down a bunch of bark chips and call it a landscaping bed? Could you plant one pansy and call that enough? Do you need to plant trees? What does it mean to make a landscaping area? So although we don't want to be overly prescriptive in terms of what those landscaping designs might be, we are recommending adding some additional clarity to ensure that those areas, are more than just bark chips. So for residential areas, per 50 linear feet, when we're talking about like setback areas, 1 tree and 4 shrubs per 50 feet. For the commercial area, 1 tree plus 5 large shrubs or 8 small shrubs for every 30 feet. These are some standards that Scott researched based on some other jurisdictions that he's worked in, and felt that these have been successful. So that's where that recommendation comes from. And then of these planting materials, of any planting materials in the landscaped areas, a new requirement is proposed that, based on your feedback and council direction, that a minimum of 50% of those materials must be native species. And the key to making that standard work is going to be identifying or developing a reference list of what those species can be. And so as detailed in the memo, there are some options that already exist. I know that the city spent some time developing their own street tree list, and so I don't know if it's of interest to develop your own list, if there's local expertise and interest. As far as the code goes, we want to hear your direction, and then we will, sort of insert the reference. But if there's interest to develop a list or something, that would be something that the city would want to take on. And likewise with nuisance species, there's new language about prohibiting nuisance species, right? Sounds like a great idea. Likewise, it needs a reference list of what those species are. And then another key part of this chapter being proposed is much clearer street tree requirements. The current code talks about, like, if you have landscape strips in your street, it would be really nice if you did all these things, and they can really provide all these benefits, but it doesn't actually say that street trees are required anywhere. So there's a new section proposed that includes the spacing requirement. It says on residential streets, an average of every 35 feet. The exact spacing can vary based on the recommendations for individual species in the adopted street tree list, that you need 1 tree per 35 feet. So this standard is being proposed. It'll help you get towards more street trees. But a couple things to point out is that right now, not all residential street sections, which are in a different chapter of the code, mandate a landscaping strip as part of the street section. So the way that this code is written, or the way that the recommended street tree code is written, it says, well, if you don't have a landscaping strip in the right of way, go ahead and plant your street tree on the other side of the sidewalk within the front yard, so that you're still providing some shade and tree canopy and greenery along these street frontages. And that's something that could be part of your TSP review as you move forward, looking at these residential street cross sections and whether you might want to include more landscaping strip requirements. Right now they're optional for some residential streets. So taking that current situation, this is how we recommend writing the code, but if and when the TSP mandates more landscaping strips, this standard should work well in tandem with that. So I think where we wanted to turn it over to discussion is to see whether you're interested in any further modifications to the private landscaping requirements. You know, those ratios about trees and shrubs, and if you'd like to see any changes to the street tree planting standards, including the spacing, and whether or not you are interested to require those beyond residential streets. The reason the initial recommendation in the code is focused on residential streets is, you know, because it adds to a neighborhood, adds significant shade and livability. And because that seemed to be the direction in the code. Again, it was general discussion in the current code, but about some of the benefits and the ways that it impacts a neighborhood, but it seemed to be geared toward residential streets. So that's what we picked up on it and tried to clarify. So, and then we can have another, I think I have another slide with some questions about those native and nuisance species, but thoughts to start us off.
How do you determine the 50%?
So the 50% native species?
Yeah, how are we determining that? Like, are we using a weight value or quantity wise? Like, what is the, how you
Yeah, thanks. Quantities. So planting materials.
So you could just plant 50% of little bushes and just like, I feel like you could get away from that pretty easy in a quantity way.
I think it really depends, you know, on your goals for the policy. When you say, maybe could you say more about what you mean by get away from the policy?
Like you could
What
plant,
policy are you wanting that you're concerned wouldn't get implemented?
I'm just thinking you could just plant 50% of like very small bushes or something. They're native and then the 50% is not. I don't know if it matters that much. I'm just, since we have that standard, I don't know if we leave it open like that, you can always, like people can go around and make it easier. So if we want trees, if we want bigger things, maybe it needs to be more specific. I don't know. That's why I'm asking about how we're.
Okay, I get, you're talking about the different type, like, should it be more specific to the different types of planting materials to make sure that the 50% isn't just met by one subcategory?
Yes.
Yeah, no, thanks. That is an interesting reflection, and curious to hear direction from you all about what you think you'd like to see.
First of all, on the 50%, well, first on native, because you're saying 50% must be native plants. How do we define native? I mean, I think we should define native. What does that mean? What area does that cover? Does it cover all of Oregon? Does it cover Willamette Valley, North Willamette Valley? I mean, I would think Oregon would probably be more acceptable than limiting it just to, you know, Willamette Valley. And also, I mean, I'm a little concerned, you know, based on the definition that we just, you know, limit it to 50%, that, you know, we would allow 50% that are non-native. And I guess what, you know, the other third question would be, what are other cities doing? I mean, what's sort of the common practice?
Yeah, thanks. And I, you know, want to preface, I'm coming to you as a zoning code expert, not a, you know, botanist or tree arborist expert. So what I have, let's see, where do I want to start on this? As in terms of what is a native species, I think that's where that key question comes in of how would you like to define native? I think in the memo, there's a list of several existing plant species lists, some of which are more specific to the Willamette Valley. There are some resources from the OSU Extension Service that talk about west of the Cascades. I don't think I included any like all Oregon references since there is such variety in our beautiful state. But picking one of those lists and deciding for the city what is important to you in native species, or if, you know, as I said, if there's interest and expertise locally to develop a City of Carlton native species list, that is a project that the city could pursue in tandem with this code update. I would recommend, just like the street tree list that the city has adopted or has developed, that list be adopted by reference in the code rather than the individual species be listed in the code. That really just adds a lot of complexity and technicality. It makes it hard to adjust that list over time. So it's really a question for the city to decide how they want to define native species and whether to use an existing list or to come up with a local list. In terms of what other cities are doing, you know, many cities aren't discussing native species specifically. The codes are pretty neutral about, you know, requiring a certain number of trees and or shrubs or other planting materials, and really leave it to individual applicants to select. There are, you know, the cities that I have seen addressing it. Actually, I was surprised by how low some of the requirements were, like 30 to I think 60% was the most I saw for native species. But of course, that's also going to depend on how specific your native species list is. If it's a really broad, you know, complex list with a lot of options, you might go with a higher percentage. If you want to develop 10 species that are native specific to the Carlton area or the, you know, Yamhill County area that you're really passionate about, then it might be a lower percentage just because you need some additional variety for folks.
So
Do you want to let Susan?
well, I'm not finished with my question.
Excuse me.
So the non-native species, what, I mean, I guess my concern is if you know, there's a percentage of non-native species used, that would be, it wouldn't come close to the category of being invasive species. In other words, if it's non-native, it's not going to cause any harm to the city. I just wanted to get clarification on that.
Sure. Yes. Thank you for that clarification. Yeah, you could think of it in really three categories. There's like natives that are maybe the most preferred. There's all-purpose plants that could thrive in a lot of different climates, but are not necessarily native to this area or the except in, you know, landscaping areas. And then there's the nuisance plants that you want to completely avoid. But again, not a botanist, but my understanding is that those all-purpose plants, there's a pretty broad selection. And so many of those can be appropriate.
Okay. All right. Thank you. You've answered my question.
Great.
Are there any other questions in the room before we go online?
Susan has one question up there.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hello. Hey, so I have a couple of thoughts. The first thought is I would be very enthusiastic about adopting, for example, Portland's native plant list or Oregon City, either one of those. I looked over those and they're very thorough, they include all the trees, shrubs native to this area, the Willamette Valley area. And I would add to that, I would adopt Eugene's prohibited list with the addition of Caleriana pear, which is really invasive and has been planted already in subdivisions and will take over native forests. So that would be my recommendation for the lists. One thing I think we have to consider when we're thinking about native species as street trees, I mean, I've investigated native trees for street trees pretty extensively. There's very few native trees that are appropriate as street trees because, I mean, the ones that come to mind are our native oak and our native big leaf maple and valley ponderosa. Those are huge trees. And so if we want to plant those as street trees, which I would love to see those as street trees, but you need a bigger planting strip for those. So you'll have to identify kind of which streets you want those on and adjust the planting strip accordingly to accommodate those larger trees. There's a few native species that are beautiful trees, but they need a little bit of shade and they need nice soil, and they really won't thrive as a street tree. I mean, like vine maple, for example, is a beautiful small shrub slash tree. As a street tree, it's kind of problematic because it does need a little bit of shade. So siting would be critical for a lot of our native trees. That being said, I think it's worth requiring some of them. We have cascara, which is a native buckthorn, which is a beautiful little tree, has great fall color, and that's a more durable native species. So there are a few that are good. I mean, a lot of in the native species world, they talk about species migration and accommodating climate change and moving those trees that are more drought tolerant from drier parts of our state, moving them here. I think there's discussion in the native plant communities around whether that's a good idea or a bad idea. I think that's just something City of Carlton will have to decide if they are on board with doing things like some of the drier oak species that are evergreen that are from drier parts of the Northwest. Those make beautiful street trees, but they're not native to the Willamette Valley. I think the best way to incorporate native species into our city is probably in the shrubs and the perennials and shrubs, and use those as understory and landscaped areas. That's all I have to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions online or comments? Okay, I think we can go to the next one, Elizabeth.
All right, thanks, Natalie. And I just wanted to pick up on Susie's point there that, yeah, back to the question of like, well, if it's only 50% native, what's the other 50%? I think just that it really allows for that flexibility to encompass like species that might thrive in slightly different conditions, or whether we're adapting to changing climate or different needs of our street trees or particular conditions and outcomes that we're trying to achieve. So having some flexibility, from what I gather in native planting requirements, is really important, because 100% native could really box you in, or a higher percentage. So, all right. I think that we've mostly already previewed a lot of this question. So again, we're looking, just had highlighted that 50%, and how we need that list, and the nuisance species also needing a list, and that there is already a street tree list that's been developed, so those street trees can come from that list. So we might have already gotten our feedback on this, but just if you have any other thoughts about this percentage and or the lists, I heard some recommendations on specific lists, but I guess I'd be interested to hear from the council. Would you like a recommendation of an existing list from us that you could adopt, or would you like to take this on and do some additional work locally about curating a list?
Francis?
I have a quick question, if I may, Mayor. Elizabeth, have you seen any codes that require the trees to not be the same tree, like in order, so requiring some type of variety?
With street trees or on private property?
Primarily with street trees is what I would like us to avoid the McMinnville issue of all of the trees that were planted in this decade are going to die at the same time.
I've heard discussion about those kinds of issues. I haven't seen a lot of codes that address it directly.
Thank you.
Going with that, could we just have a list and not have to mess with the 50%? And then with that list, could that list be some sort of fluid list that we can remove or add things as we wish? Like we see too many of these three, and we want to remove it from the list. Could we do something like that?
The city could certainly have a list in terms of fluidity, it would probably need to be adopted either by resolution or ordinance. And so it's not, so you could amend it frequently. It doesn't need to be in the development code. As I said, I recommend keeping these lists as separately adopted documents, but it would require ongoing maintenance, shall we say, just like a tree.
I can just.
Scott.
I concur with Elizabeth's comment there with respect to the resolution. It's just a quick act that the council can do. I've seen that more frequently. A list adopted initially by resolution, and if there's a certain variety of tree that's no longer available on the market, or a tree that's making all kinds of problems and things like that, you can always amend that. So I think more cities go the route of just for code wise mentioning a list that is adopted by the council. And that list might have that 50% of what is native, what is not native. It might be that we crib from Portland or from Oregon City if Commissioner Terrell has a look at those, and they seem to work for those communities. So so that might be something that comes to council on a resolution basis and more updates. But I'm just sort of thinking that we would structure at least the name of that document in the development code.
Agreed.
Any other comments, thoughts?
Susie has her hand up again, Mayor.
Do you have your hand up again, Susan, or is that?
Yeah, I do, actually. I heartily agree with the diversity requirement. I think it was Council Skipper that brought that up. And the city of Portland actually does regulate the percentage of street trees. So they, in any development, there's a requirement of, they regulate it by genus. So if you think about, all maples are typically susceptible to some of the same pests and diseases. So they regulate how many maples you can plant, or how many birch you can plant. So I think that's actually a really useful way to regulate. And I think you can look at the model of the Portland street tree list and look at that restriction that they have that encourages diversity, because that is super important. I really strongly would recommend that we really focus on diversifying the street trees. And I think we can incorporate a lot of native species into our shrubs and understory. And I think that's going to be really valuable for wildlife. And I think it will result in the healthiest streets. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay.
Great. Well, we've got the plants all sorted. So also in terms of, green spaces, green infrastructure, if you will, we've heard about council priorities around creating these pedestrian connections through new development. And so in the code, there is, it just rolls off the tongue. Mid-block pedestrian bicycle access ways is the official term for these. And they are a requirement in new subdivisions wherever the block length exceeds the maximum, which is 600 feet. And so if the block is longer than that, then near the midpoint, we added some proposed language that specifies this connection needs to be near the midpoint of that long block, not, because that's where it gives the most good that they have these connections. And right now they are only required to be 10 foot wide with a 5-foot sidewalk. And given the interest that we heard in making these more robust and providing room for both pedestrians and bicyclists, the proposed development standards increase that total width to 20 feet and require a 10-foot paved path rather than just 5 feet, using the remaining 10 feet for landscaping. So that could be either 5 feet on either side of the path, or 1 10-foot and 1 10-foot landscaping area and 1 10-foot paved path. And then also some specificity in those standards about ratios of trees and shrubs, similar to the to the landscaping requirements we just discussed. So it's a very difficult thing to find an image of. So these homes are not set back as far as would be required. So this image is a little bit misleading, but I thought that it had a better balance of like sidewalk and green space of what we're talking about. And so questions for you is, do these development standards meet some of the goals you've identified to create these green connections? Are there further adjustments you'd like us to look at to some of the widths and improvement standards that could help you get the type of facilities you're looking for?
Comments, thoughts?
Is this like if you have two streets that are 600 feet long, we got the numbers you said,
Yes, yeah.
at the midway point, 300 feet, you're connecting those two parallel streets.
Right, it's like a mid-block cut through. So say you have, your block and there's, rather than having to go all the way down to the corner to go around, if it's more than 600 feet, then there is a perpendicular pedestrian path that cuts through the middle of the block to essentially create a shortcut.
So then these pathways, I guess, are gonna be lined with fences of the neighboring houses. And there'll
Right.
be some, shrubbery along those, on the sides of this sidewalk?
Yeah, so part of the change with these development standards is that there would be requirements for shrubs and trees within these pathways so that it isn't just sidewalk fence.
So then who takes care of that shrubbery?
Yeah, great question. So I believe that because they are, oops, that's the wrong direction. Because they're required as an access way, that they would be dedicated to the city the same as any other street or transportation facility.
So it's more stress on the city maintenance crew to go out, take care, water, clean, weed on these areas. So we need to hire more maintenance.
Yeah, there would be operational issues to consider.
I have a question for Gordon. What's the average length of our city block right now?
Right now, it's about 250 feet.
Oh,
50 feet, a block.
Yeah. I mean, we have some longer, some shorter, but in general.
do we have any exceeding 600 feet at this point in time?
I think we have one that's close to that.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Yeah, I think an interesting consideration for this is almost every city I've worked for has a similar requirement like this. But there aren't very many situations where the block length triggers the creation of these mid-block standards. And so, if you're really interested in creating more of them, you could talk about what the block length standard should be or should not be. But it's really meant as a mitigation standard for really long blocks. And oftentimes you just see that the block length, that developers prefer to meet the block length standard than to incorporate these.
Decision, comments?
I think that the requirement, that anything in excess of 600 feet having a cut through mid-block or a pathway mid-block, that sounds reasonable. And it also, I guess, make getting outdoors and getting around more accessible if you ever extended your block lengths. And that would lend to, I think, healthier modes of commuting, possibly. I don't know.
Right. Yeah.
Susie. Susie has her hand raised.
Oh, Susan.
Okay, thank you. So I very much like this idea because it will encourage people to leave their cars in their garages and walk, and which will increase street traffic to or foot traffic to our downtown businesses, which will increase business downtown. Anytime you're giving people a lovely option to walk or ride, you're encouraging that behavior, which is beneficial to our downtown businesses for sure, because the more people they have walking, the more foot traffic they have, and that's just a clear relationship. The other thing I want to emphasize is that the landscaping would be a crucial part of that, because nobody wants to walk through a tunnel with 6-foot fences on either side. It's really not pleasant to do that. And I also like the example of the winding pathway, because that's very much more attractive and allows for slightly larger planting areas. So I would encourage you to adopt this code, and I would encourage you to make that winding pathways through there, because it'll be a nicer, more inviting pathway. Thank you.
I have a question, actually, the question's for Shannon, getting back to what Grant had asked about who was maintaining, this landscape in areas. Who currently maintains the landscape along the easement right away, whatever it is, on 7th Street, on North 7th? As you enter, before you enter Carlton Crest.
Before you enter Carlton.
When you turn on 7th, there's that whole area where there's trees, there's beautiful landscape where the brick wall is.
Yeah, it's at the HOA.
Homeowners association.
So it's privately, the
Yeah.
city does not maintain it. Okay.
Not yet. HOA may give it to them.
Okay.
Okay,
All right, thanks. Next, we wanted to spend some time talking in more detail about cottage cluster design. So the first part of that has to do with the individual cottages themselves. As we discussed, the idea behind a cottage cluster vaguely is you get more smaller dwellings on the same spot. So defining how many more and how small is a key part of the standards. And we talked about how many in terms of the density standards and the in the individual zoning districts. But this is a chance to talk about the dimensional standards to create these smaller dwellings. What I have learned in working in many jurisdictions is that like a cottage is in the eye of the beholder. There's really a lot of different interpretations of what that means, what people think is small enough / big enough to be a cottage. And so the recommendations in the draft try to walk sort of a middle line, mostly following the Oregon Model Code for cottage clusters. So the first piece there is allowing a 900 square foot maximum building footprint. And so that 900 square feet, gives you an option to, or gives someone an option to develop a workable but modest single story building. But that coupled with a 25-foot maximum height limit does allow for up to 2 stories of development. So there can be some additional floor area on the second floor. Cities have, what I've seen is that cities have gone anywhere from 900 square feet maximum floor area to, which would be just 1 story, to 1,800 square feet. 1,800 square feet, that's 2 full stories. And just sort of based on the tone of some of our previous conversations, the draft includes sort of a compromise of 1,600 square feet as the maximum floor area, erring towards being more generous, adding more flexibility, allowing more of these to be built, potentially, but not a full second story that can, start to look a little more boxy. But, you can provide we've seen a lot of cities adopt 1,800 square feet with the latest round of middle housing code updates from the state. That is the model code recommendation. Again, that's not binding for the city of Carlton. It's just one sort of goalpost out there that you can measure yourself against, or, you know, a wayfinding device, shall we say. So 1,600 is the recommendation, but we can go up or down from there. Within that 25-foot height limit. And I have a couple more examples to show you. You know, I think that I heard there were some questions about like, but what are people actually building within these standards? And first of all, I would say it's really a transition time for cottages as this new Oregon model code has been adopted by a lot of cities and is coming into place. A lot of the previous projects that were built before the state model code was enacted would be more similar to this example. This is in Newport, Oregon, in South Beach, south of the Aquina Bridge. And these are more of a 1.5 story style. So they've got a full first story and some additional living space on the second floor, but not a full second story. So that's what we've seen in some of the earlier cottages. There's been a lot of discussion about how to push cottages and how to create more opportunities, because while these 1.5 story, you know, dwellings were really like they met a lot of favorable reception, there were very few being built. And so the idea, you know, these were built, let's see, 2012 or so. Maybe a little bit earlier. So they were built in that era. 2020 coming in, the state's writing this model code, trying to be more flexible, allow more creativity and latitude within the cottage standards to get more projects built. And we really haven't seen what that next round of development, how it's going to iterate and what it's going to look like. But that's, you know, the lay of the landscape, so to speak, as we see it in, wow, 2024 now. Another piece of these designs, a couple other pieces to highlight. We talked about the cluster size limits, how many cottages can be included on a site around a courtyard and share that courtyard orientation. So based on the recommendation and discussion last month, the code includes a maximum of 12 units for the R1 and R2 zones, and no limits in the R3 and mixed density residential zones. These design standards really address the site layout to ensure that this critical clustering of homes facing the green space rather than all being street oriented occurs. It also includes standards for how much common courtyard space is required, how it needs to be developed, how what facilities need to be connected by pedestrian pathways, just to ensure that there's movement and connection within the site. And then final piece, as we mentioned, the minimum parking is 1 space per unit, and that can be provided through shared parking areas. So like a small parking lot, for example, is what serves this cottage cluster, or it could be individual garages, either attached or detached in the back of each of these in the back of each cottage. So the code creates options for both. It doesn't require one or the other, just whichever option is chosen, there's standards to say, well, it can be so big, but not bigger than this, has to be organized like this. So as I said, I had a couple other examples. These are both in, you know, what I would call that first wave of cottage projects, similar to the Newport example. There's a famous regionally famous architect called Ross Chapin, who it was behind the design of these, he termed these pocket neighborhoods, really has created some beautiful spaces with these shared green spaces, you know, cottagey scale, traditional type residential architecture, beautiful places. People seem to love living in them. Communities seem to love having them. The issue was there were very few of them getting built. It was very difficult to find a site that was large enough, and the cost of building all these individual small homes and the common spaces was really a limiting factor on where they could get built. So we're seeing changes in the code. As I mentioned, this is a more recent project. in Silverton, Oregon. And fun story, it was a former planning commissioner who got together with some of her friends, both in the city and other places, and they were aware of the cottage code. So you all are in the know now, you could do this too. And they organized to build their own cottage community using the rules that Silverton had adopted. So you can see these are slightly larger structures. The city has a drone that they use to take photos. So this was cool that we could get this perspective on it, but slightly larger in terms of the height and how they relate to each other. They took more of a linear courtyard approach with all the structures facing onto that. And then just in the bottom, you can see some of those shared parking areas. As I mentioned, that's one option rather than individual garages. So just another take, and we'll continue to see how folks iterate on cottage housing around the state. I think, you know, I've been in conversation with Shannon and hearing some of the questions and interests about cottage housing and thinking about what it might mean for Carlton. And I think that I don't have a crystal ball. Cottage housing, you know, remains that smaller scale, more focused product for smaller housing. Cottage housing can do that well when the base zone standards for single family development are also working well. And in communities with high growth pressure, where there's a feeling like the allowed densities are too low and the minimum lot sizes are too high relative to land costs and what homes are selling for, then developers start to look for, where can we find the loopholes in the code? And then you find developers that are trying to use the cottage code just as a way to build, you know, more homes on the same site, because that's the way that they see the project working out financially. And so there can be more pressure, you know, undue pressure, if you will, on the cottage code if the base zone standards aren't working very well. But if the cottages can be sort of free to be cottages, then you can see it a little bit more of a tailored use. So, chance to turn it over to you for discussion on cottages here about what you think about that 1,600 square foot proposed size, or if you'd like to adjust that. Other refinements you'd like to see to that cluster size, maybe, you know, reflecting on our conversation last month. And if there's any other questions or changes about the cottage standards that we can discuss tonight.
Yes.
As you said, you know, cottages are sort of in the eye of the beholder, and, you know, for myself, I don't envision, you know, two-story it has not been my vision of two-story cottages. But having said that, if we do allow for that, for the 2 stories and the higher square footage of livable space, I would like to, I mean, this is my viewpoint, is that we should have you know, so if you have a cottage cluster of 12 homes, that there's a limitation on how many of those homes can be the 2-story model. Just otherwise, you know, a developer, just as you were saying before, I mean, well, this is our chance to put in a home that has high square footage and make it as dense as possible. And it takes away from the whole, in my opinion, concept of cottage clusters. And also, I think we have to look at you know, the types of individuals that may want to purchase those type of homes. And I think many of them are going to be, you know, retirees, seniors that want to have that single-story living space, want to have a smaller space and a single-story living space. And having 2 stories could be problematic for them. And so it's an opportunity to be able to purchase that type of home. Anyway, those are just some of my ideas about it.
Thanks.
Anybody else? I'm trying to figure out, is that Susan?
No, somebody else.
I,
Noel?
Noel.
okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I would like to echo, and I can't see the name tags of the folks who are talking. I don't recognize your voice. So my apologies, but I echo the same sort of sentiments and also hesitate on the two-story. You know, I like the idea of having some limitation in between how many two-story units could be built within a cottage cluster. 1,600 square feet feels like an appropriate maximum for me. And just also thinking about it from a DEI perspective, thinking about young families in addition to into others who might be able to, looking at the way our economy is and home prices and sizes, the affordability factor, especially for folks who have, one or two kids. And I'm not terribly clear, I guess, on whether or not the requirements that you've put forth at this point are that the courtyard would be centerfold. I would prefer that option versus the photo that you showed. And I think that sums up my comments. Thank you.
We have a comment from Jack as well.
Yes, thank you. I've been trying to develop a cottage cluster for the past several years now, and have looked at doing it in a number of different jurisdictions. And it is harder to make the numbers work when you're looking at a bunch of small cottages. You have a lot of exterior walls, which come with insulation and siding and everything that runs with that. So that drives the cost up. And certainly when you're looking at smaller units, that drives a lot of the cost factor. Personally, I'm not too concerned about the single story or the two story. I can work and make things work in either scenario. One thing that did concern me looking through the draft was a number of the parking cottage requirements. I don't know if Elizabeth, you're going to go through those a little bit later. But I know looking at the lot sizes, that's one area that does concern me. If you're going to go in that later, we can discuss that in a moment.
No, now's a great time. I'd love to hear your specific feedback.
So I was looking at that, and we mentioned earlier this evening that block sizes are an average of 250 feet. So if we're looking at something in the R1 zone, a cottage cluster needs a minimum of 15,000 square feet. So at that point, you're looking at roughly half a block. And so you're going to end up bordering 3 streets, which in an R1 zone, and I understand that the other zones have even smaller allowable cottage cluster sizes. But the R1 zone, you'd have 3 streets that you'd border. And so you'd have a 20-foot setback all the way along that. And that makes your cottage area your area for cottage and courtyard, because the courtyard needs to be bordered on 2 sides by cottages, very small. And then looking at the parking requirements, it looks like to do a cluster of parking, you need to be at least 20 feet off the street before you can have a parking spot and then a drive lane, or vice versa. So you're looking at giving away 60 feet all along one side of a lot to be able to do parking. And if we're looking at a residential neighborhood, you've got your 20-foot setback. That's where most people are going to build their houses. Right in front of that, you're going to have a driveway where you can park a car or two. And so in a cottage cluster, it seems like we should be able to do something similar, that you would have your parking in that same 20-foot driveway boundary, rather than dedicating that just to be open space and yet not open space that's part of the courtyard. And so I've been playing around with trying to make things fit to get even 4 or 5 reasonable cottages on a lot in the R1 zone, knowing what the average block size is across Carlton and whatnot. And we lose a lot of space to the outside that can't be part of the central courtyard, but that has to be dedicated to that. As part of that, looking at the access requirements, which I think was 17,100/040, that single family homes require you'd only have one driveway access. Duplexes, you might be allowed two. Multifamily, you have one street access with a possibility of a second for some sort of circular. But there's no mention of cottage clusters. And I could see if we were having to dedicate half a block to a cottage cluster, that you could have access from all of those streets, that you could have a little cluster of parking, to the north and a little one to the south and a little one to the west, that each only had 2 or 3 cars, but that would help break it up from having this 6 or 8 or 10 car parking lot that you have to develop, which would feel out of place in a otherwise residential neighborhood. So I was looking at those as different options, but then the code seemed to be quite restrictive. And this has unfortunately been my experience in a number of other jurisdictions where the code has a vision in mind, but it forces us down a path that I can't make the numbers make sense to actually go through the process of developing one.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. I'm having this picture in mind of the city of Milwaukee did a code audit of their cottage cluster standards and found that there were some sites that by the time you took into account all the setbacks and the cottage and the common open space, you could make like a 2-foot wide cottage because that was the only one left. So your perspective is really valuable here because we, didn't have the same scope to do a really detailed analysis of how these pieces add up. So I appreciate you pulling these all together. I've made some notes to look more into these access standards and parking and the setbacks and how those pieces interact. So I think those are going to be really important to success of this going forward, and appreciate your initial review through what this could look like.
I was looking at some math on this with a 20-foot setback and let's say that you built a 900 square foot house, that'd be 30 by 30. You have a 40-foot wide courtyard, which would be an incredibly small courtyard. By the time you get a 20-foot setback, a 30-foot wide house, a 40-foot wide courtyard, a 30-foot house, and a 20-foot setback, you're at 140 feet, if my math is correct. How wide now we talked about the length of our blocks. How wide is our average block? Gordon?
It's the same. It's 250 by 250. That's a average in Carlton. That's how the old streets were laid out. There's obviously areas where it doesn't fit that, but
yeah. But on average, we could easily park a cottage cluster. If I don't know what the courtyard width requirements are, and if we've even specified that, and is that something that we would want to specify? Because 40 feet wide between house to house, doesn't leave much.
There is a proposed, right, I should mention to part of your packet, Elizabeth's doing a great job of summarizing things here. Pages, 74 through about 78 of your packet this evening has the current draft. And I think what Elizabeth is saying is maybe we can adjust these numbers that are shown just on the question the counselor asked about the minimum dimensions there. Common courtyard, at least on the draft stage, we have it must be a minimum of 15 feet wide at the narrowest dimension. And the current draft on the minimum size of the courtyard area is 150 square feet per cottage within the associated cluster. So there's some base draft proposal here, and I think Elizabeth, correct me if I'm wrong here, that this is the state, is this based off of the state's model code for cottage clusters?
Yes, correct. As an initial recommendation, or as our recommendation, we incorporated the provisions from the Oregon State Model Code for cottage clusters.
Okay, and so sort of keep that in mind that's the initial, but Carlton is not required to follow that. There are some jurisdictions of a certain population size that are required to have these standards, and as they haven't been in place for not longer than about a year or so, it's the test of time whether the state standards will work in the marketplace as developers say, hey, they work or not. And I would imagine that they'll be subject to change in the future, but you have that latitude to look at this and say, yeah, we want something larger or smaller, 2-story, 1-story, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and just, to add on to that background Scott provided, that, these are relatively new standards. They are the best practices recommendation. The state put a lot of effort into working with developers and doing that analysis. For example, I mentioned that the city of Milwaukee did a whole project analyzing their cottage cluster standards and identifying a lot of obstacles. And so, that kind of thinking was done at a much larger scale for the state to try to come up with these. It is a one-size-fits-all kind of approach. So that's not to say you can't further refine them, but there was really some, thought behind them and analysis. And I think that the tricky part is, maybe not some of the specifics that Jack mentioned here, but just that the overall sense that, you start talking about, oh, if we're going to specify this minimum dimension here and this minimum dimension here, and oh, we really, want to see this happen and be a part of a cottage courtyard. There can be a lot of good intentions that add up to an awful lot of requirements that make it difficult to build, and then there are no cottages. So trying to find that balance, trying to get that sweet spot, can be a challenge, which is why we recommended starting with the best practices in the model code.
Any more thoughts, comments, folks?
I think I agree with what we have before us.
I would say, the only thing I'll say, I think one of our goals is provide more housing in Carlton. And if increasing the minimum or the maximum, the maximum gross floor area from 1,600 to 1,800 would improve that, I would approve that, or I would recommend that. I don't know if it makes that much of a difference, but just having more space, I guess, would allow more people to live in a place, and that's our goal in Carlton, because we know houses are very expensive nowadays, especially for younger families. It would be really difficult to get a house, and maybe perhaps this could be like a initial home purchase and sort of affordable. So that's my point of view.
I would support the increase of 200 square feet, because when you're living in a house with 1,600 square feet and you bump it up another 200, that's a lot of room that you've gained. And it could add to the livability of a small house, especially when you have, I have 3 kids, and if you're trying to stuff a family into a 1,600 square foot house, that could be pretty tight, but that extra 200 square feet can make a huge difference.
Actually, I have a question. What is usually the age group that you're looking at in cottage cluster dwellings, residents? Do you have any idea on that?
Well, I think that we've seen cottage clusters be used different ways. I don't think that the development code has an a priori target in terms of age ranges. We certainly hear anecdotally that there's more interest among older adults in cottage clusters. For example, that Silverton example was, the planning commissioner had retired and was, put this together with her other friends as their retirement housing plan. And it can lend itself for that, but there's no reason that it needs to be focused on that. I'm thinking of another example closer to me here in Northeast Portland, that is a lot more family oriented, and they have a lot of variety of cottage sizes. There are some smaller and some larger, just sort of depending on the family needs, but can be used for different groups.
Yeah, I understand it can be used for different groups. I was just wondering what you see as the general, if there's any kind of a trend for age groups that are using these.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I normally am working with the codes and I hear about certain projects, but I'm not aware of any analysis or even sort of anecdotal impressions of overall age distribution in cottage projects.
Thank you.
So with what Shirley had mentioned about, when we're talking about cottage clusters, in my mind, a cottage is a single level with 12 units or 6 units, whatever. If we're gonna go 2-story, 1,600 square foot, is that not transferring into a townhouse cluster? I mean, we're 1,600 square feet, there's a lot of houses in Carlton that are actually smaller than 1,600 square feet.
Well, for instance, ours is 1,100 square feet.
Yeah,
2 people live there.
single level.
Single
right.
level.
If you start getting them from 1,600 to 1,800 square feet, the cluster or the cottage part has gone away. I mean,
Well, I mean, that's why I'd like to see diversity in,
maybe a
and
story and a half or a story and a loft or something within. in a
diversity, within a cluster, having some that are single level, some that are like, single and a half, like you just mentioned, and some that are 2-story, but not uniform. If you just leave it open, I believe, some developers will come along and just, everything will be 2-story. It just totally takes away from the concept of a cottage.
Right. Yeah.
Can we put a limit on it? Like 1/3 of them are single story, 1/3 of them are story and a half or story with a loft. And
Posing that question, I mean, I don't know, Elizabeth probably can respond to that.
You certainly can. That isn't something that I've seen in other codes. And I think that if that's something that's a priority for the city, you certainly can. I would be, just concerned about the more you layer on, trying to create a specific template for each project, that it leaves less room for, sort of individual projects to respond.
Okay.
So just a caution there.
Yeah, that's my concern as well, because the developer will come to make money. He's not coming here he's not a not-for-profit. So he's coming here, his standards probably a lot easier for them. Like, they're not gonna want to design different types of houses. So I think it makes sense. If they come, there's gonna be a standard. If they have a maximum, maybe they will do it, maybe they won't. But I think it's too much of us trying to control everything, and I think we just, yeah, I think we need to allow them to, like, we have certain guidelines, but not micromanage every single process of this development.
Okay, we have a comment online from Jack.
Yeah, speaking as a small developer here in the county, I know that the more restrictions that are in place, the harder it is to make the numbers work. And that, in my opinion, is why we've seen so few cottage clusters actually built over the years, is that it really takes a particular vision and a desire to do it, because we like the aesthetic, because from a pure profit standpoint, they don't always make the most sense. Now that will change in different zonings. If we are in the R1 zone in Carlton, for example, there's only so much that could be done. But the property that I have in mind in question that I'm looking at, I could subdivide and put put 2 houses on, or I could keep as a single lot and put some sort of cottage cluster, which would allow a variety of housing, like you're talking about, of different sizes. I can't speak to who actually does live in these because we don't see very many. I know when we do our own market analysis internally, we're looking at what's in demand in the area. So we're looking at is there a demand for 2 bedrooms? Is there demand for 3 bedrooms? What size are we looking at there? Fitting 3 bedrooms into 900 square feet, you're not really going to do. But once we get above, 1,200 square feet, you can build a comfortable 1.5 story or 2-story 3-bedroom house. So yes, an extra 200 square feet, bumping it up to 1,800 would make that bigger, but I agree that that might get away from the sense of it being a cottage. I don't see a problem with the 1,600 square foot limit there. I would hesitate to put in requirements about how many have to be a certain story. I know the lot I'm looking at is naturally sloped, and so it would make sense to some of them to be 2-story with a daylight basement, but some of them higher up on the hill might just be a single story, and they would all feel like they'd be of a similar level and wouldn't be dwarfing each other. But again, opening up things allow, you mentioned a townhouse cluster, and what's different from that, I know the cottage, the way it's written right now requires separation between the cottages. But there are options if you had a common wall cottage to have 2 together that were tighted together, and that would reduce the overall amount of siding that you would need. You'd need a firewall between the 2 dwelling units from the building code perspective, but that would allow more flexibility in terms of not creating 6-foot strips between every single cottage just to meet that separation requirement. So I know a lot of these requirements that get put in here are trying to guide what you hope to see, but that's not necessarily what's actually supported by the finances. So those are my thoughts on just some of the comments that people have made, that we do want to keep it from being just feeling like a big multifamily set of apartments. But at the same token, putting too many restrictions on there does start to concern me. Especially with the small block size, and that there aren't that many lots in Carlton where this is even doable right now. Such that if we want to see any of them, we need to allow flexibility in some of the requirements to make it work for us.
Sure, Gordon.
The block size is just average. There are blocks that are larger. There's no requirement right now that it's 250 feet. That's just how the old town was laid out.
Sure. And the property I'm looking at is in Old Town. And so that's what I'm looking at when I'm running my numbers and doing my drawings. I'm not trying to say that they don't exist, just that it is harder to find a 15,000 square foot lot in the R1 zone that is in a location that would make sense for a cottage cluster, that would be walkable to downtown or be walkable to other areas, and not have to be one that's right on the outskirts of town just to get a lot size that's large enough.
Okay. Thank you. Elizabeth?
Great. A lot of good thoughts and questions here. I think I emailed a few folks. I am having some technical difficulties. My computer is trying to force me to restart and do some updates, and I'm trying to dismiss it. So, but if I drop off, that is the reason, and I'm not sure if I'll be able to rejoin you. So fingers crossed that isn't going to happen, but just to explain in advance, let's make sure that we touch on our last of 5 here, hopefully before that happens. Vacation rental standards. There's some draft code we incorporated that I believe Shannon and the city attorney and Scott all worked on, and there's been some discussion to date. Based on our discussion last month, these standards we wrote them to be dwelling type neutral, which is to say any type of dwelling, including ADUs, including cottages, would be eligible if they meet all of the standards. There is language that says the license is specific to an individual dwelling. So it wouldn't, if it were for a cottage cluster, it couldn't just be any one of those. It has to be specific to a single cottage or to the ADU. And there would need to be a separate license for each dwelling, if more than one licenses were sought per site. Right now, there's nothing, we did not include anything in the draft restricting multiple rentals per site or in proximity to each other's. And then the other key change is reviewing these vacation rental licenses through a staff level. That's what we're calling a type 2 review, according to these new standards. And that planning commission, rather than reviewing that initial application, would save any involvement to potential appeals of the staff decision. And so your chance for discussion here, does it, one sort of, general background questions and especially some technical specifics, I would point to Shannon and Scott as some experts on that. But specific to this question about, more than one vacation rental on a site, curious if you'd like to see any standards addressing whether more than one rental or more than one vacation rental can be located on a single property, if it should be restricted to a single rental, or other standards along those lines. Thanks.
I would like to see something along those lines, but not necessarily in the same location, but in the same area. That's something we talked about before. We haven't adopted yet, but I think having a lot of vacation rentals all in the same place could potentially be a problem, I guess, in a neighborhood where everyone is a vacation rental, or you have a cluster where every single house is a vacation rental. So it's, if it's something that could be in the code, I think that would be ideal to have some sort of limitation there. We want diversity and have maybe vacations around the city, but not occupy all the same places.
Elizabeth, the first part of your question, I think I read it correctly, like on a single property. So are you meaning if somebody has an ADU and a residence, that's a single property? So like they couldn't,
Or somebody has a triplex, could all 3 units be rented out as vacation rentals? Or would you want to restrict it to 1 unit per site or no more than 50% of the units per site, something like that?
Or the council president has brought up before, there's one owner of a 12-unit cottage cluster.
Right.
But that would a cottage cluster necessarily be on, those would be on separate property lines, correct?
Not necessarily for a cottage cluster. They can all be developed on a single property and divided as condos.
I mean, I have a serious concern about, just using that as an example, serious concern about someone conceivably owning, all of the cottages in a particular cluster, and then they're all rented out as VRBOs. I would not want to see that happen.
We got caught with that a little bit, not even with all of the same owners, but with townhouses, new townhouses over there on Monroe Street. Which we have,
Majority of them are rentals.
All of them are.
all of them are.
I know of one, I think there's somebody living on it, but I know the vast majority of them are rentals.
Yeah. Yep.
Elizabeth, a follow-up question. What do you see throughout different areas? Like I'm sort of familiar with the city of McMinnville. I think there is a standard that limits proximity. Do you see a lot of towns and entities doing that? Or what is kind of the standard that you have seen?
Yeah, I'd really defer to Shannon and Scott as more subject matter experts here. So love to hear what they think.
It really varies as towns, at least what I've seen, as towns struggle with this question. Some have tried zoning in certain areas, or there's more permissive use in, say, R3 zone versus R1 zone to try to control it, or to control it in different areas of town, or to use the spacing requirement. There's not really a consistent standard that I've seen, and that different towns are trying different things to see what works for them. We did talk about during the vacation rental discussion that there's a natural trend for vacation rentals to be centered around whatever the town's attraction is. If you're in a Colorado ski town, it's gonna be around the ski resort. If it's near the East Coast beaches, it's gonna be near the beach. In Carlton, it's gonna be centered towards downtown. It's going to be a natural inclination. So that people can walk and visit wineries and the restaurants.
And I think at the time we had that discussion, we're discussing whether we wanted to place some limitations, but we decided to just kind of monitor it and come back to it.
That's correct.
Yeah.
It's kind of a tough one because if you have a 12 unit cottage cluster, say with one owner, you know, you limit it to one individual property,
Mhm.
you know, it's kind of complicated, really, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Yeah, because if you. Yeah, because you could have one owner come into town and buy 12 houses
Mhm.
and no different than building a cluster.
Yeah.
And turn 12 houses into all rentals.
And that is also, I'm sorry, I missed that. That is also one thing some towns have used, is you can only have one vacation rental or one short-term rental license per owner.
Oh,
That would be helpful.
So then that, under that saying, that would delete somebody owning 12 of them.
Mhm.
Only one of them then can be a rental.
Or if Counselor Skipper puts an ADU on his property, he can only rent the ADU or his house, one or the other, or another house in Carlton.
Are we talking individual or a company? Could I just create a different company and rent that?
The town that I'm thinking of, it was limited to one individual or company.
So you could just get away from that very easily.
I would defer to how our city attorney feels, but the town I'm thinking of that was considered acceptable at that period of time during those legal challenges to vacation rentals. It was also not transferable. So the home could not be held in a trust that then would go to another person or to another entity.
So I could have like my son put his name on the house and have him rent the house. So stuff like that could still happen. And I guess I don't know why I'm asking this, it's just more legal things, but I just think it's something that people could get around really easy. And
I think the attorney would have probably some viewpoint about whether or not you could put a vacation rental license in your minor's name in order to have it in perpetuity or longer than the estate. He might have something to say about that.
I think
a lot of cousins. You know?
I think as a council, you know, in terms of our discussing this as a policy matter, we're sort of dealing with two competing forces, you know, and one is the need for more housing and more affordable housing versus being in a tourist desirable community where folks want to come in and, you know, build or purchase a property and rent it out. So there's that force, and then there's, you know, the other that we're dealing with. So I think we have to keep that in mind when we, you know, look at our guidelines.
yes, and to something that Jack hit on earlier is that this all is driven off of market needs. We have a higher rental need closer to downtown than we have, let's say, out North 7th Street. North 7th Street, I don't think we're gonna see a bunch of vacation rentals out North 7th Street because it's a long ways from what our tourists that are visiting us would consider that close to the action in downtown Carlton. So I think that the natural barriers to developing rentals farther away are already in place just by market needs.
Are you saying that's not? Carolyn?
The vacation rentals are already on 7th Street.
Oh,
People walk from Seventh Street. I walk all over Carlton from Seventh Street.
that's the nice thing about living in a
Yeah,
small town.
one
You
of the
can't-
vacation rentals caught fire this year.
Oh, okay,
Was not
On
occupied at the
Seventh
time.
Street.
okay.
Yeah, I think our whole town is very desirable for tourists, period. I expect them to start renting those apartments.
Okay.
We need to just limit so many vacation rentals per street.
Yeah, I thought we had discussed this before.
Had a discussion on that,
We discussed
except
it
we're
and
just gonna let it go.
at that time it was decided to monitor
Okay,
it. At that time.
that was in 23. This is 24.
Amy, have we had a sudden bloom in vacation rentals?
We had 15 licenses or permits applied for in 2023, but I checked the real estate market on a weekly basis, and of those, there's been a half a dozen, maybe 4 or 5 at the minimum that have sold. So the licenses are not transferable, so that takes them out of the market of vacation rentals. So yes, we have some more, but the way the market is shifting, they're actually some sell, so.
How is that increasing year over year? Is 15 a lot compared to like 2022 or 2021?
Yeah, but we've never had this many sell either in one year, so it kind of averages out to what prior years are.
And we've also, oh, go Grant.
But with those ones that sold,
Mhm.
has the new owner applied, because it's not transferable.
Nope, it's not.
And as we've also experienced some growth. With this growth, has the ratio of vacation rentals stayed the same or is it increasing?
Stay the same.
Okay, thank you.
And those that have those new applications,
Mhm.
do you have any idea of where they're mainly centered at now? Within-
Yeah, a bulk of them, they have, if you have downtown and then the surrounding, blocks around it, maybe 1 block or 2 block window around it, they're kind of out of that. So a lot of the houses that were already long-term or short-term rentals, and they have been for a while, are centered around the core. Now we're kind of 3-4 blocks kind of out of that. So we're kind of working our way away from, but we're still more center location in town for the downtown core.
Yeah, it's that we just lost it.
Yeah, it looks like we just lost Elizabeth, so sorry about that.
So do we have any resolution for recommendations on this?
Sounds like as we're progressing along, the ratios are staying the same. So we're ending up with more housing units for families to live in. As we're progressing along. So I think that this meets a healthy balance between providing for our tourism and providing for families that want to come here and live. I think that this is very healthy. And at this point in time, I think we should just let it be because it's balancing itself.
Yeah, continue to monitor. It's probably not necessary to cure a problem that doesn't exist at the moment.
I'm happy to continue monitoring. I know the building permits come through, so I can see if we have a reduction in building permits, that's could offset the ratios as well. And then I also keep track of the vacation rentals that come on and off the market. So I'm happy to continue monitoring for you guys.
Awesome, thank you.
The rest of you?
Is there any monitoring at all in the city of not vacation rental, but long-term rental? Is there anything, those owners don't have to do any kind of registering or anything?
I might be a minority, but I prefer to have a plan than monitor something and then eventually something happen and then you have to have a plan, then you have to come up with something fast, but yeah, I think monitoring is fine, but there's so many things that could go wrong with a lot of variables and numbers that, like, do we know the actual number of houses in Carlton? Are we taking into account maybe? Yeah, I don't know. I think there's a lot of different issues that could arise, but.
I also think that, I understand what you're saying. But I also think that we should also consider how many of the main dwelling units versus the ADUs. We may, what is the ratio right now? Is it like 3% or?
Our current code doesn't allow for ADUs,
Oh, yes,
so right now.
but in the future, that would be something that would have to be taken into account, right?
Depending on how the vacation code is modified here or not.
Okay.
If we allow it.
Well, yeah, we are going to, but how you allow the permitting, whether it's one for the property, so both houses or units could be, or if it's gonna be one unit and one per the owner. That's you guys.
Scott, you look like you've got
So I
some.
think that that's a good dynamic that we're introducing something that could change. And so that is just something that they account for is the ability to have more than one unit on your property. And in that event, it might be that you see an increase, may not see an increase. Sounds like it's pretty small, and I know Amy's been asked that question how many times now? But yeah, you never know what turn in the market it might be.
Okay.
So, Amy, I was just curious, what is the ratio right now for vacation rental units?
I don't have the number pulled up. I
Okay.
just updated my spreadsheet today so I can keep track of the total number, which we have 52 permits issued. But of those, there's probably a dozen that are active, meaning they have the permit, but they have perhaps either a long-term renter in there or the owner is living there or whatever the reason might be. But we're not collecting transient lodging tax from them.
And you keep track of that pretty close.
Try to.
I mean, kind of like, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, like, it's gotta make sense for somebody at some point too, right? I mean, so, I understand council president's concern about, a 12 cottage cluster turning into all vacation rentals. But what's the reality of those renting out? Like, so at some point, it's gotta pencil out for somebody, you know what I mean? I don't see, we have a limited number as it is, and some of them sit vacant over weekends and during the week, so. I feel like to me, that's less of a concern, because at the end of the day, somebody's gonna make money off of it, so you're not gonna want 12 cottages sitting empty for the majority of the year. I do not like the idea of us limiting it to one owner, like, period. I think that kind of infringes on kind of property rights. I don't think it's, setting the cottage cluster portion aside, I don't think it's unreasonable to say per property, if somebody's building an ADU, you can rent out the ADU or you can rent out the residence. That makes sense, but then you get into the townhome section of things and the cottage cluster, so it is kind of tricky, and I wish I had a crystal ball that I could.
But so just to add on to what you're saying, Kevin, it sort of goes back to my thing about the competing forces here, because, as the council, we're looking at, as a policy matter of having enough housing available here in Carlton. So, yeah, you could have all separate owners. I mean, I live here on Grant Street and, half the time I live in a VRBO ghost town on Grant Street because there's so many all around me. And so even if it's one owner, houses can sit for a long time, especially in the winter without any activity. Number one, but number two, it takes them off the market for others to be able to either purchase or rent a place as a long-term rental. That's my, I just think that's something we have to consider.
Yeah, I'm surprised there aren't even state rules or guidance on this vacation rental business. And the whole state is trying to provide housing. And a lot of the new housing is going into these vacation rentals.
People buy property as an investment, so
Yeah.
even if it sits around, it doesn't really matter to people like we. We have business property in the main street that doesn't get used.
Yeah.
So I think that we are trying to limit that type of business, so people like families or whatever can buy a house. I think that's what we are trying to accomplish here. Like, because investing is fine, but at the same time, people need to live. We don't want a bunch of homeless people. And more houses we can have, I think the better. And putting limitations on vacation rentals is a way of providing more houses to people.
I think Carlton has been lucky up until now that we have not had a lot of the large corporations coming in and buying up property as we've seen in Boise and some of the surrounding areas where, you know, the funding is coming in and they're just buying up the property to buy it up. It's an asset to the corporation, which we've not seen around here. So we're short, were you gonna say something? Oh, okay. But, well, help me out. I'm just kind of stumbling along here. We haven't seen that happening in our community. But you do see that a lot. So that's always something that's a little bit unnerving. And I don't know how we control that. When you were talking about people wanting to buy property or buy assets, it made me think of that. I don't have super concerns about the way we're handling the vacation rentals right now. I think it's something that we need to keep a close eye on. We need to be watching it real carefully. But right now, we're in pretty good shape, except for the 6 townhomes on Monroe Street, but it's up to you guys.
I think like creating something with the unknown future is kind of difficult because I know specifically in other areas, it kind of backfired and there was a lot of outlash and, with developers and property owners because there was this sweeping, this sounds good, let's keep it all separate. And then everybody's up in arms saying, what do you mean I can't? I gotta be 5,000 feet away from another vacation rental. So that worries me, trying to, again, not having an issue right now, putting some plan in place that we don't know if it's gonna make sense, if it's gonna work.
I use the 3 vacation rentals behind me that are all facing out onto West Main Street because as an example, because those 3 houses basically really with the traffic and the situation we've got right now with the traffic in the street over there, they might as well be vacation rentals because the poor people that live there are miserable. And so if you've got 3 houses that maybe they are empty a good portion of the time, but I can't imagine living there on any of those.
And they look nice. They're well kept up.
They are well kept up. They are, yeah. And I remember when I moved in there, they weren't. So that's one of those situations where it's actually enhanced the neighborhood.
Right, and with you saying that, Linda, that's true that the vacation rental people, if they don't keep them up, they're not gonna be rented.
Yeah, exactly.
And they get bad reviews at the same
Yeah.
time. It's a self-regulating industry. So.
From that perspective,
Mhm.
as far as the maintenance and upkeep of it, yeah.
I still think that it's very healthy for us to have the vacation rentals because it supports our tourism industry. For the longest time, we had antique shops in town, and the antique shops struggled to bring people in. They had brought a few people in. I'm very thankful for what we have in town because we went from logging town to almost a dead town.
Mhm.
And the antique shops would come and go, and there'd be a lot of dead space in town. But now downtown it's vibrant, it's full of life, and something that supports that is our vacation rentals. So it's for those of us that were here in the 90s, it has changed a lot, but I'm thankful for what we have.
We got about 4 minutes here. We gotta shut this down, so we need to make a decision.
A decision?
A decision, yeah, we actually have to, we're gonna have to make, yeah. So do we want to just leave it the way it is for
I
now?
think we should, let it go and watch it for the year of 24. And see what happens. And my gut feeling is maybe someday we'll inch closer to maybe coming to some total percent for the town or something like that of vacation rentals. But I don't know. I don't have an answer.
Maybe every quarter we look at where the numbers are at.
Yeah. Or once a year, probably
year.
is good.
Yeah,
At the
once
rate
a
they're
year.
coming in right now.
Well,
I
Amy's
think it's gonna
keeping,
take a while for this to be
Yeah.
adopted, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And see what happens throughout this process. So I think it's, again, kind of rushing to something, to implement something now. Because we always have the option to revisit it.
okay,
And I would like to kind of have like a base number, like starting this year, like what's our base number starting this year, moving forward? And if we see a sudden jump, like a doubling of vacation homes, but no growth, I mean, that would be a concern.
okay. Righty. Natalie, are we good with everything?
I believe so. Sorry again for Elizabeth's drop off. She emailed and her computer is rebooting, as she mentioned. I will relay the rest of the conversation over to her. This was the final main topic of this evening. The rest of the presentation was optional, so we did make it through that. And yep, we will be in touch.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have a motion to adjourn?
A motion.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, we've got. Okay, thank you. So we are convening the Carlton Urban Renewal Agency. Reports. Would you call the roll, please?
Counselor Kevin Skipper.
Here.
Counselor Britt Erickson.
Here.
Counselor Gary Rendell.
Here.
Counselor David Samuel.
Here.
Counselor Carolyn Thompson Riser.
Yeah.
Council President Shirley Word-Millie.
Here.
And Mayor Linda Watkins.
Here.
President Danforth.
All righty. Okay, the agenda items are the minutes, approval of the minutes from June 7th, 2023. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
Make a motion to approve the minutes as presented.
Yeah, really.
All in favor?
Aye.
I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, we got it. All in did we get through all in favor? Of approving the minutes?
Yeah, I don't think
Who
so.
was the second?
I second it.
Oh,
Okay. Did we vote?
I don't think so. Now we vote.
We need to vote. Aye.
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 Okay. Sorry, guys. All righty. Second item is the urban renewal financial report for FY 23.
I'm apologizing in advance for my voice. That's why I'm harbored in this other room. Didn't want to give you what I've got. So we are required by ORS annually to do a report. We have to post it in the newspaper 2 consecutive times by ORS standards for urban renewal funds. What this is a recap of what the year was looking like at items 1, 2, and 3. Those are what we are our actuals, and items 4. I'm sorry, 1 and 2 are actuals from the budget that's already passed, and items 3 or 4 are what we are anticipating this year for tax revenue. The second page is what that impact has on our other taxing districts. The tax assessor provides this to me every year, so you can see there's a little bit of a difference from the sum from number 1, which is the 249,000, and that's just because the discounts haven't been applied. So the public notice has been done. It's coming before before you guys, and then staff is recommending that you move it forward to the city council consent agenda to receive the report. Any questions?
Can I just clarify, the discounts are we talking those discounts that if you pay early your property taxes?
No, those are, so the fire district, urban renewal expands our boundary, and we collect taxes from other taxing districts to help support the growth of downtown in our community. So that's what they would have got if we did not have urban renewal. Does that make sense?
Not really.
Okay. So if you look at the chart, let's just take Chemeketa Community College. They tax our citizens in the city. If we did not have an urban renewal, try not to cough, they would have received an additional 11,148. That tax got deferred to us in our urban renewal. That's why often the fire department would say, hey, you're getting some of our money for that growth downtown. So you could see with the Carlton fire, it would have been 18,000 they would have gotten in taxes.
Okay, so
This,
what are the discounts and the interest? That's what I'm trying to understand.
oh, I'm sorry.
What those are.
So the tax assessor provides me the 258,000 figure and the table. But if you look in item number 1, that we received 249,000. And so we receive after the discounts have been taken off if they paid earlier, that taxing district had some type of discount. So that's the difference between the 258,000 figure to the 249 we actually received under item number 1 on page 1.
Okay,
It's
so
not
it is
our
paying
discounts.
early, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And just for information, because this question's come up before, we will have the urban renewal until the year 2031. But we do have debt service obligated to our urban renewal fund. So we'll be leaving the fund open till 2038, and we'll have to hold back the Meadow Lake payments to make sure we have enough in urban renewal. They're obligated to pay $1 million of the Meadow Lake loan. That's just kind of a heads up if you're nerdy about urban renewal.
I have another question, sorry.
No
So
worries.
so the amount that we actually spend is a little higher, right? And we have the debt service expenditures. So is that normal?
That is normal. So our materials and services, which is about $6,000. This is under item 2 for actuals. And that is our audit, our state filing fees, any professional services that hit that. It's relatively low because it's a small budget. Improvement expenditures is projects obligated by the Urban Renewal Fund And so I can't spend over what we have. So we have a good beginning fund balance that we've been carrying forward. Those are for expenditures approved in the urban renewal plan for the development of downtown, and there's like several other things. And the debt service expenditure is the 65,000 that pays towards the Meadow Lake every year.
So we usually carry a beginning balance, and that's why we're able to
Yes,
use
we
a
have
little.
a pretty healthy beginning fund balance. I don't have it up in front of you. It slowly but surely increases.
Do we have to give it back once that's over? Like
Any
what happens
ending
if-
funds? No, that's for us to spend on the projects outlined in the plan. So nothing goes back. We will actually run out of money before to finish paying off Meadow Lake. We're estimating at almost 400,000. We'll have to hold in that fund until 2038.
Okay. Any other questions? So we have the staff recommendation here that Carlton Urban Renewal Agency approve and move forward the urban renewal financial report on the city council for FY23. Do I have a motion to approve this?
I make a motion that we approve the moving it forward. It's read.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Motion carries. Let's see, that is pretty much the end of the, yeah. So do we have a motion to adjourn this meeting?
Motion to adjourn the meeting.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. I'll see you in a few.
Yeah. Okay, it is 8:15 PM. We are starting the January 9th regular session of the Carlton City Council. Could you call the roll, please?
Yes, Councilor Kevin Skipper,
Here.
Councilor Brent Erickson.
Here.
Councilor Gary Brandau.
Here.
Councilor David Hill.
Here.
Councilor Carolyn Thompson Riser.
Here.
Council President Shirley Ward Mullen.
Here.
And Mayor Linda Watkins,
Here.
all present and accounted for.
Okay, could you join with me in saying the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay. What do we got here? Are there any changes or additions to the agenda?
No, Mayor, there are.
Thank you. Ceremonies, appointments, announcements. We are looking at Planning Commission reappointment of Commissioner Terrell. Is that, do you have any comments on?
Commissioner Terrell is seeking reappointment to the Planning Commission. Her interest has been put into your packets.
Okay, does anybody? How do we usually do this? Do we, well, she's not here.
Supposed to do a motion, right?
There's a
Are we just-
recommended motion on page 109 of your packet.
Do I have a motion on this?
I move that the council reappoint Susan Terrell to the Planning Commission, extending her service for 4 years and expiring on December 31st, 2028.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Okay, B, Mayor's Activity Report. Haven't done much in the last couple of days. We started doing this, the council president and myself and city manager because I've been attending a few more outside meetings and getting involved, not necessarily getting involved, but just because there's a lot of activity right now with legislatures coming into session and everything else. Let's see, did the information that I sent in for the packet,
It's on page 112 of the packet.
okay. So, yeah, there is a report on page 112 of the packet, which is a summary of a couple of the meetings that I attended in the last month. I don't know if you guys read those, if you want to discuss anything on there, if you have any questions about it, or you want me to give a verbal report. This is a new thing, so you tell me what works for you.
Verbal report.
I was afraid you were going to say that. Thanks, David.
No problem.
So, yeah, there were two meetings I thought that were really of note. The first was, and I'll take them in order. The first was a discussion that Representative Elmer had put together with the district mayors in her district regarding a new measure 110, which is the Drug Addiction Treatment and Recovery Act. This was intended, it was a bill that was intended and does basically decriminalize certain drugs. Law enforcement is apparently having some difficulties with this because what is happening, what they see happening anyway, is that the people that are using the drugs are becoming, they're not, they have no incentive. This is how law enforcement has, and some of the other mayors in some of the larger cities, with decriminalizing, the folks don't have the incentive to go into rehab or to go into treatment programs. And they're also seeing more and more folks out on the streets using drugs, and there's no way to help them. There's what the mayors and the law enforcement were saying is that they are seeing more an uptick in use and an uptick in more drug users on the streets, but the law enforcement has no way to pull them in and put them into treatment programs, and there are obviously not enough treatment programs to help them. So the discussion came down to, they don't necessarily see rescinding Measure 110 completely, but they are really struggling with trying to figure out ways to help law enforcement and also to help the drug users to get back into treatment and find ways that they can help them get off the streets and get back into a treatment program that will help them and move them along into a little better situation. So I think that they're talking about probably doing some modifications on the measure. It's just not probably going to be this session, but she's starting now to work on that. So that's about, this was something that and I think we're very fortunate in Carlton that we're not dealing with this. I talked to the chief about this before I went to the meeting, and it's not something that we're seeing in the volume that they're seeing it in other parts of the state. So it was kind of an eye opener for me. The other one, December 19th, just a week later, was an open house that Congresswoman Salinas did, held down in Salem. So I actually had to get in the car and drive to Salem. It was traumatic, but I did it. I think this is probably one of the first times in a while that maybe this district has had this kind of a representative who is able to come in and make herself available in this capacity. I got down there and I think probably every jurisdiction in her district was represented at this meeting. And it was just strictly an open house. Hi, how you doing? Shaking hands, what can I do for you? How can I help you? Congresswoman Salinas was very much aware of the sewer breakage that we had just had and was asking questions about that and what was going on with that. So we talked about that a little bit and some of the other things that we need in Carlton. We did leave it kind of as a suggestion that maybe she needs to come up and we would love to have her come up and visit us. And I think that that city manager has been in contact with her office to follow up on that and try to bring her up here so that she could see a little more closely what we're dealing with in our infrastructure, particularly our wastewater infrastructure and the needs that we do have. So that was basically what I did on those 2 days. If you have any questions or comments or thoughts, you're more than welcome to comment.
Thank you for representing our town.
Thanks, David. Yeah. It was, they were actually great conversations and it's really kind of nice to get out and be around some of the other mayors and some of the other spokespeople for the other districts and jurisdictions. It's a good way to remember that we're not living in a bubble, but also that seeing what other people are struggling with too. So I really appreciate, really appreciate Representative Elmer and Congresswoman Salinas for making the effort to do this because I think their intentions are good, their heart's in the right place, and they're trying to do something that really is going to make some big differences for all of us. There we go. Okay. Any other comments? Anything else? All righty. Citizen comments. This is the section of the agenda that allows members of the public to address the city council on any items off or on the agenda. When invited by the mayor, members of the public shall come forward, state their name and street address, and direct all comments to the mayor. Comments are typically limited to 3 minutes unless additional time is allowed by the mayor. We start this with item A, which are items that are not on the current agenda. Does anybody have any comments out in the world? Oh, we do see Mr. Stewart.
Good evening, City Council. This is Anthony Stewart. I'm here on behalf of the Planning Commission. Just wanted to first start by saying thanks for the 2 hours that you just finished in contributing towards a comprehensive plan. It's meaningful. It's stuff we see on a regular basis. I know some of you have been involved in city government for a lot longer than I have and had some exposure in the planning process. So I know that you're approaching this with thoughtfulness as part of an ongoing initiative with members of the city council, mayor, and city staff. We're trying to have in every city council meeting at least one representative of the planning commission, just so there's a little bit of back and forth cross pollination at the very best. And at the very worst, you guys are just annoyed by us by a very little bit, hopefully. But just again, want to express my thanks. We see this stuff on a regular basis, and some of these changes that are proposed, I'm spending a little bit more time reviewing them, but I think it's a really great initiative. It's a great effort, and we see the benefits presenting themselves already in the things that are coming across our transom. So just want to say thanks. I'm going to be here for as long as I can this evening. I've got a newborn, and I may need to go relieve my wife relatively soon, who has been fighting him to go to sleep for about 2 hours. But I just want to, again, say thanks, appreciate everybody's service, and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks. Thank you, Commissioner. And good luck with the baby.
Thank you.
Okay, and then we move on to item B, which is items that are on the agenda. Is there anybody that has out there that has a comment about anything that is not on our agenda tonight? Okay, you're not getting any comments? All right. Moving right along. Do I have a motion to approve the consent agenda?
I have a comment before you approve.
Okay,
The general ledger expensive versus budget, page 123. And it's currently really hard to read the percentage available and the accounts. I just want to point that out. Maybe for the next package, you can have a readable budget there. It's just there's all bundled together, the percentage and the account number.
Well,
Maybe
are you
change
on
the
one,
view.
123 here now?
Probably need to change it to not for.
Oh, I see
landscape or
that,
something.
Guy, I don't know what that's doing. It didn't do it on the other ones. We'll check on that report to see what happened.
that's what happens when you start a new
We
process.
gave it a whole bunch of extra decimals. The numbers are accurate. It just, for some reason on that page went crazy.
Yeah.
So
Okay. Thank you, Christy.
you're welcome.
Any other comments? Do I have a motion to approve the consent agenda?
I move to approve the consent agenda as presented.
I second it.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Consent agenda is approved. Thank you.
Madam Mayor, before you go on, I just wanted to, in the consent agenda was the budget fiscal year calendar. With the move of the Civic Center, we are trying very earnestly to move up, bringing the budget committee meeting in April and adopting in May, so a whole month early. I just kind of wanted to point that out. It's a little different this year. We didn't want to try to be doing the budget at the same time of moving into the new building. So just give everybody a heads up. We'll be sending out some meeting reminders if I can make it happen. I can't guarantee you yet.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. Yeah, you guys don't have enough to do. Thank you. Okay, ordinances, resolutions, discussion and action items. The first action item is the election of the council president, which we do every year. So do we have any nominations for council president?
I'd like to speak first. So I just wanted to, I have now served this last year. I have served 4 years as council president, and I appreciate the opportunity to serve the council in this capacity. I'm of the belief and hope that this happens going forward, although I've enjoyed these 4 years. I think that this is an opportunity that every counselor during their term or multiple terms should have the opportunity to do, and I know we don't officially have any kind of rotation, but just, perhaps going forward, we can always have that in mind to give others the opportunity. So I am, myself stepping down from this year and wanting to nominate someone. And so I would like to nominate Kevin Skipper for council president.
Okay, thank you, Shirley.
Second that nomination.
Okay, Counselor Skipper, do you have any comments?
No, I appreciate it. Thank you so much. I just wanted to also say I appreciate the leadership that Shirley has given throughout, I've been on the council for 3 years and both the mayor and Shirley as council president. I do appreciate it. And so it was a kind of a steep learning curve, and it was very beneficial as a new incoming counselor to have years of service and both steady leadership. And if that's the route you guys want to go, I'd be honored to serve in that capacity for the coming year.
Are there any other comments?
Are there any other nominations?
Okay, pardon?
Somebody else? Are there any
Well,
other-
it's been moved and seconded,
You just vote.
so sure.
I vote yes.
All those in favor?
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Thank you, Counselor Skipper.
Appreciate it.
Okay, we are at resolution 2024-349, appointing the Assistant City Manager as Budget Officer for FY 25.
Yes, Madam Mayor and Council, I'm coming before you again. Since 2014, I've served in this capacity. I'm striving to even make it a prettier document this year, even though we've been tasked to bring it forward. But I'd be honored if you could move and approve the mayor to assign and appoint me as the budget officer.
Do we have a motion?
I make a motion that the city council approve and authorize the mayor to sign resolution number 2024-349 to appoint the assistant city manager as the budget officer for fiscal year 2025.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
Did we skip this urban renewal thing?
This part of the consent agenda.
Oh, each one.
Resolution, city manager. Okay, we are at item C. Resolution 2024-350, extending workers' compensation to volunteers. City manager, do you want to make any comments on this?
Actually, we're gonna go back to the assistant city manager.
And I haven't coughed at all, so you guys are really lucky. This is a housekeeping item. It's required by CIS, our insurance carrier, that we adopt a resolution every year for coverage to our volunteers. The volunteers can include the police reserves and non-public safety, public officials performing non-administrative duties, park and recreation volunteers, clerical support, like in a volunteer capacity. And basically, if we have any volunteers during the year, I have to track their hours and report them to CIS, and also for my workman's comp audit. So this is a housekeeping item for our insurance carrier.
Thank you. Is there a motion?
Yeah, I move that the city council approve and authorize the mayor to sign resolution number 2024-350, extending Carlton's workers' compensation insurance coverage to the volunteers of the city.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Okay, down to resolution 2024-351, FY 24 budget adjustments. I'm assuming that probably is going to be a comment by the assistant city manager also.
Yes, it feels like a budget meeting, doesn't it, when I talk so much? Um, so we had scheduled to purchase a public works truck 2 years ago. And with COVID, they put them on a long waiting list and we weren't expected to get it for another 4 years. There was a long list. It came up this year where they called our public works director and said, we've got one, but you have to commit to it. And so we did commit to it. We gave up, we were supposed to get a snow plow this year and some other things. So, but we really needed that dump truck. We would have gone back to the bottom of the waiting list. So this is just a budget adjustment. There's no fiscal impact. It just moves it out of contingency and adjusts the budget for the truck purchase.
Okay, it is moved that the city council approve and authorize the mayor to sign resolution number 2024-351, authorizing budget adjustments for fiscal year 2023-24.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
With that, Mayor and Council, I'm going to log off for the evening and head home. Have a good rest of the meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Night, Christie. Okay, on to item E, ordinance 2024-747, public contracting update.
I'm gonna keep up the pattern and just hand it over to our city attorney.
Oh.
I also haven't coughed.
And we appreciate that.
Did I type this in?
I didn't change it.
During the, I don't just want to read that because it's very boring. The state legislature during the 2022 legislative session changed some provisions of the public contracting code. A lot of the changes that they passed don't apply to local jurisdictions. They're specific for state government agencies. However, some changes were made that apply to us, most notably the ranges in which we are allowed to use less formal bidding procedures when awarding contracts went up. And it is more efficient if we can use a less formal process. The public contracting portion of our code was originally passed in 2005 after the Oregon Public Contracting Code was adopted, and it had not been amended since then. So this is a good time to make a little tiny update. I did late in the game provide a red line copy of the code so that you can see specifically what was changing. Primarily the contracting thresholds are what initiated this change, but then there was some opportunity to tidy things up a bit. And there were some spots where the language just wasn't quite right anymore. So we tightened that.
Well, it certainly looks neater.
Oh, is that something that just didn't come through? The actual red lines? I have exhibit A in front of me, but I don't see any red lines on it.
It should be an extra.
Oh,
It was a handout. You came late.
Pointed out. Things you cannot.
And today we learned that Counselor Skipper is colorblind.
I like the printout on there, that Counselor Safer is, yeah.
It looks like these extra changes that you made, looks like most of them are kind of just sort of cleanup things as opposed to really substantive, like the one that you specifically addressed.
Yes, it is not especially substantive except for the threshold numbers.
Is there any discussion?
So you're changing from 25 to 50,000. A lot of those, it looks like, right? So. Without reading it here, so are we just changing the scope? I guess if it's less than 50,000, we don't need to do any formal reading.
So with the change from the spots where it changed from, now I don't have my red line, from 25,000 to 50,000, that was to align the provisions of this public contracting code with the purchasing policy that we passed earlier this year. Oh, thank you. The thresholds for what form of procedure we have to follow is under 25,000, a local jurisdiction can essentially do whatever they want. And then between 25,000 up to 250,000, soliciting informal bids is allowed, and then at over 250,000, we have to do the whole big real thing.
RFP.
Yeah, or RFP.
Well, it's not 50, it's 250.
250.
Yeah, okay.
I segued from Councilor Randall's question into talking about some other numbers.
Can you remind me, this is only the city manager, or is this, I know we talked about this, does the public works director have the ability to do?
So this doesn't address who can spend this money. This is just how the process that the city has to follow in order to award contracts. So this public contracting references our purchasing policy. And I don't remember off the top of my head what, I know that we gave the public works director or department heads, I think up to 10,000. 25,000.
And the city manager 50,
And the city manager 50.
which I've been using that well.
50,000, not just $50.
And so that doesn't change in this just.
This is not changing the purchasing policy, no.
So can we do a resolution tonight to adopt the amended ordinance?
We have to adopt it by ordinance because it's changing the code, but
True, but I mean, can we do that tonight?
yeah, yes. I prepared it as an ordinance 2023.
Council President, if you needed some suggested language.
I was gonna say, where's the words?
Okay, so we do the first one, vote, and then do the second one.
You do the first one, then there's a vote, and then the second.
Okay. So I guess I'll
Yeah,
start.
yeah.
I move that council authorize the reading of ordinance 2024-747, amending chapter 3.04 of the Carlton Municipal Code relating to public contracting by title only.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Okay,
Ordinance 2024-747, an ordinance amending chapter 3.04 of the Carlton Municipal Code relating to public contracting.
Okay. And then I move that council accept the first reading of the ordinance 2024-747, amending chapter 3.04 of the Carlton Municipal Code related to public contracting.
I second it.
first, okay, it's been moved and seconded. All in favor?
Just a roll call,
Aye.
Mayor.
Oh, shoot, this is one of those, yeah, okay. Roll call.
Counselor Kevin Skipper,
Yes.
Counselor Grant Erickson,
Yes.
Counselor Aaron Brandau,
Right,
Counselor David Samuel Hill,
Aye.
Counselor Carolyn Thompson Riser,
Aye.
Council President Shirley Ward Moon,
I guess I am still, or am I not? Council president.
Counselor Shirley Ward
All right, anyway, aye.
Moon.
Aye.
Are you still mayor?
Some days, I'm not so sure, but. Okay, So where are we done with that now?
Yes, we'll have our second reading on my birthday.
Oh,
But if we
happy
all had- wait, I have
birthday.
a question. If we all had said, voted aye, there wasn't any, nays or, what do we have to do a second reading?
We always have to adopt ordinances by 2 readings.
Oh,
If there is unanimous consent, we can pass it at one single meeting, but it is my recommendation that we follow the charter provisions and hold readings at 2 separate meetings. Hold the readings at 2 separate meetings unless there is a pressing reason to adopt it at.
so even though technically we could, you're suggesting we don't. Okay.
Okay. And moving right along, item F, community room discussion continued. City manager, it's your turn.
Well, I am going to continue the trend, but you will see in front of you a lot of work by Ms. Amerson of updating the community room policy outline and application. A lot of it is based upon your conversations, and a lot of it is as we've been updating it based upon your conversations. We found that some of our model agencies had also updated their own policies, and so we decided to add those and incorporate them into here for your review. Ms. Emerson, do you want to say any more to that?
The red lines in the working document application is what was new compared to the old. You can see there's quite a bit of, the agencies that I was double referring my applications to from our previous one have added a lot of additions that kind of more like give us more safety and minimizes our risk. So being that we're kind of not sure how this room is gonna work and how we want it to work, it might be on the safer side to mitigate our risk ahead of time.
Take it slowly.
Yep.
Yeah.
Big steps.
Good idea.
Does anybody have any comments or questions? Discussion?
I have a question about recurring rental of the room.
Okay.
I don't see anything there unless I missed on here.
There was not a good resource that I could find from going to different entities on any type of recurring in uses. If we use our reservation calendar, and then how city needs to use the room, how the council needs to use the room, it's not going to be real easy for recurring just because there's gonna be so many different, not just city uses, but also we're hoping other entities using it. So it could self-mitigate itself by not having a recurring, the option for a recurring. But it is something that we can add, but we really don't know. There was not a good guidance tool for me to add to know what parameters to put in. Meaning other cities haven't maybe run into this problem, but is it something they needed to add to their application? Yeah. Potential.
There are a lot of cities that have a community room that they rent.
It's actually quite a few. I was kind of surprised too.
It's good.
I think you're getting a lot of it covered that I never thought of.
Yeah, that's what I think.
Is it normal to have like those groups like we have in the local and not for profit and then everybody else? So like a practice.
Yeah, for the fee schedule.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What are the difference right now? We don't have an amount yet, right?
We don't.
Or are we looking at like,
That'll be next month. We'll bring, of course, some recommendations for rental rates and deposits and cost per staff time.
so there will be a staff there anytime something is happening?
Not necessarily. We don't have the ability to hire an event staff. And so, but there is certainly going to be staff time involved and possibly helping set up a room or making sure tables are available, reviewing applications, answering questions about AV equipment, sound systems. There certainly will be staff involvement, even if we don't have somebody there for the entirety of the event.
But at least they're, yeah, because staff will have to be there just to make sure that things are set up as they should be.
And it may be a situation where staff has it pre-set up or meets with them ahead of time.
And it's something like that, yeah.
During work hours, but the event is after work hours or on a weekend.
Yeah. At some point, you want some staff supervision is what it amounts to. So it's just a question of when.
Staff will always be involved because it is our facility. But yeah, we probably will not be just monitoring, making sure everybody blows out their candles appropriately, no wax all over them.
No red candles.
No red candles.
Do we know at this point in time yet, like, it seems like a very minor detail, but I do appreciate the facility key checkout kind of thing, check-in. Do we know, like, it feels a little bit more more of a problem if the facility isn't locked? Like, do we know if we're gonna have the technology to auto lock?
We will.
So like, you know what I mean? So somebody could just take off on a Friday and then you would show up on Monday
And the doors are open and the
Doors are
windows open. We, not so much the windows, but we have invested quite a bit into the first floor as far as security features, and partly because of exactly that reason. So the fact is that we can issue a temporary key that is only viable for a certain day within a certain time period. And after that time period, it automatically shuts off and cannot be utilized again. That means the doors are locked as long as they aren't propped open. So, but there will be an alarm system as well. And so there will be some ability to monitor whether or not there is an open door.
Is it part of the plan for the police to not necessarily just stop by, but just look over, especially if there's an event late at night and stuff like that, just make sure things are closed?
Well, the benefit of where the proximity of the community room is it's right next to where the police live. So as they're coming in and out, I think it's a natural occurrence to have them check on their own home and make sure that things are going.
But they may or not be there late though, right?
But we
Midnight?
always try to stagger shifts, so somebody is going to be on shift, most likely during which we have the ability to rent the facility. I believe the hours you had, Amy, was till 11 p.m.
Correct.
Yep, 11 p.m. So if we have anybody in the building at 2 a.m. and we don't have somebody on shift, we have a different problem.
From what I've seen of the police department, they're pretty much out and about most of the time anyway, and that would not be an issue. I don't try to spy on them, but they're just right there.
And as we mentioned, the building will, in addition to the system for keyed entry, electronic keyed entry, there will be an intrusion system. There will be cameras. And
Yeah.
so there will be the ability to monitor the building quite closely, particularly the first floor. We've invested heavily in the first floor.
Are we gonna have the ability to do all of this reservation things online, or is it gonna be a physical paper coming to the city?
We are working on being able to do it online. In fact, today we had a meeting and we've gotten some new ideas about system improvements. We just need to determine whether or not our current system has the capabilities to do what we saw today. Is that accurate? And scary, yes.
Scary.
A little bit of a side trail. Do we have the ability to online rent the spaces in the park?
Not currently.
Oh, okay.
We would be working towards a unified system.
Okay. That's wonderful. Thank you.
A lot of the work that you are doing into the community room policies, we will be incorporating into the special event applications. So you'll see that revision coming for the next few months.
Cool. Thank you.
As consistent as possible, so people know when they're renting from the city what the rules are. Okay.
Other discussion? Comments, thoughts?
Good work. Keep up the good work.
Okay. Okay, there's no action that we need to take on this.
I'm hearing that you're okay with everything that's been proposed in the red line so far. Yes, I didn't hear anything.
Of course, our police would be able to access the cameras and everything, but do we have like a group of employees that would be able to access the cameras, or would there be somebody on call and answer alarms or check on the building when, if they're supposed to be out by 11? Is there somebody that can just pick up their cell phone and check on their cell phone and make sure that everybody's out?
I'm sure we can arrange that, and if we do get called, I don't have to go down because they're not abiding by the contract. They do get charged. It's written in there where we, depending on the staff member, that we will charge. They're being charged for that.
Are we gonna have a camera on the community room?
Probably plural.
Yes.
But we shouldn't talk about that in open session.
What?
Because that's talking about security of our building. That's an executive session discussion.
All righty. Any other discussion then?
Motion to adjourn?
I was gonna try to get through, make sure everybody was through discussing before we pop into that, but having already said it, we have a motion to adjourn. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Mayor, you deserve an award because we were done before 9.
Yeah.